All right, so here's what we're going to do today is I'm going to walk you through how to answer the document-based question for the AP exam for world history in 2020. So first thing that I want you to do is I want you to remember some of the steps that we walked through on a call yesterday. So here you've got the layout, and if you remember kind of the high-level overview is you're going to get a prompt. You need to make sure you look at what the prompt is asking of you. It's going to ask you to either compare and contrast two things. It's going to ask you about, did something change or did it stay the same over a certain amount of time? Or they're going to ask you to evaluate the causes of some event. Now they can ask those questions in slightly different ways. They may say, explain the differences. That would be a compare and contrast. They might say, in what ways were these similar? That would be a compare and contrast. They may say, what stayed the same over a period of time. They might say, tell us about continuities over time, changes over time. Again, that's all talking about what were changes or similarities. And in causes, again, they might say something like evaluate the causes. It might say what was a major cause. The next thing that you need to see in the prompt itself is, did they give you categories? Did they say, describe the differences in the European countries and Asian countries from 1500 to 1600 politically and socially? Okay, did they actually tell you, or did they just leave it open where you choose the categories? One of the things I want you to be sure to remember is if they allow you to choose the categories, think really high level. Think military, social, economic, trade, gender. Any of those are good categories to use. And if you want to refine them down some, you can, but those are really good ones to keep in your head. If you kind of remember that SPICE-T acronym that I gave you on your graphic organizer, again, any of those type of high-level foreign affairs, any of those type of categories are really good to use. So if they didn't give them to you, you need to develop yours as you look through these sources. The next one that you need to remember is you need to take a look at what the time period is. Make sure that you're very keenly aware of whatever that time period is. Then, once you do that, again, what I recommend is that you take out a sheet of paper and you write out, you're going to have 5 sources, 4 are going to be written, 1's going to be visual, and I would write out 1, 2, on your piece of paper, document 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay? And as you go down through these documents, you need to read them quickly. What I would tell you is, if you got 5 documents, I would take around 10 minutes. I would take 10 minutes to read them, analyze them, and again, remember how you analyze them. I want you to think about what is the historical context, the intended audience, the point of view, and the purpose of those documents. Now guys, do you have to do all 4 of those things? No, but if you can for sure understand at least one of those things about each source, you're going to be in a really good spot. To me, purpose is usually the easiest one to identify. Historical context also, what's going on around this time period that influenced this event. But again, I'm going to show you some examples of that in a minute. But those are great ways to know that you are analyzing the sources you should. And I would jot those things down by document 1, document 2. Next, I would group them. If in the prompt they gave you categories, like they gave you economics and social, put them in those categories as you're reading them. Just already start grouping them up. If they didn't, you need to identify something. Okay, you need to identify some overall category that you could connect certain documents to. You really want to get that split of 2 and 2. Okay, so out of 5 sources, you need 2 for one paragraph and 2 for another. If you could use all 5, so if you could do a 2-3 split, that's great. But you really want to have 4. Okay, you really want to make sure that you have 2 and 2, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as we go. Once you have that, you're then going to plug them into our thesis formula, which is X. However, A, therefore Y. Okay, you'll probably just have 2 big arguments you're going to use with this kind of narrowed down version of the document-based question. So you're going to have argument X and argument A. Okay, so X, again, whatever statement you're going to make, let's say it's a military one. So a change that occurred was in the growth of the military from this standpoint. However, we also saw a lot of the economic layout of society remain the same throughout this time period. Therefore, there were a lot of changes during this time period, but a lot of the economics of society remained the same from 1500, whatever. So that's your basic thesis. Once you figure out how you're going to plug things into your thesis, you're going to start writing your paper. Again, I think about 15 minutes in needs to be where you're at this point. Okay. So at about the 15-minute mark, remember you have a total of 40 minutes, 5 minutes to upload the exam. So you're 15 minutes in, you're going to start with that first paragraph. And remember, I've kind of given you this outline here to help you with a high-level view. And again, I would keep this outline with you for the day of the test. Again, normally, you wouldn't be able to have a sheet of paper on this exam. It's not cheating to have these things out. That's fine. Remember, you're going to start your first paragraph by contextualization. That's 2 to 3 sentences of what happened before this topic they've asked you about. The example I gave you the other day was Star Wars, right? They start off every Star Wars movie with, in a galaxy far, far away, and then boom, they tell you what just happened, right? The Princess Leia has been captured, whatever. So that's the background. So the fight scene you're about to see, what just happened. You need to do the same thing with this. One of the pieces of advice I want to give you is your contextualization needs to be in line with the prompt. If they ask you about war, you need to be talking about what were some previous battles or wars or complications between these countries leading up to this moment. If they ask you about economics, your lead up needs to be helping to explain what was going on in the economies of that point in time. You don't want to do something completely different. Like if they ask you about gender roles, and all of a sudden you're like, well, there was a war 30 years before. That doesn't help. You're setting up the argument you're about to make. So again, you need to make sure that that's in line with that. I'd give 2 to 3 sentences. I would really try to be as specific as you can. Talk about the people, talk about the events that were going on. 2 to 3 sentences, then jump into your thesis statement. Write that out right there. Next paragraph, you're going to start off with whatever your argument was. The military changed a lot during this period of time. Then you're going to show your evidence. And the way you can do your evidence is 1 of 2 ways. You can say, in document 1, the general, blah, 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 blah. Or you can say, the general of the British Army changed strategy throughout this time period in the way that he controlled local peoples. Parentheses, document 1. Now, I usually say do that. Just put the parentheses out there and put what document you found that statement in. But however you want to do that is fine. But do label it. Make sure you explain where you got that from. Then you want to make sure you explain why your evidence supports your statement, right? So if you're saying the military changed a lot during this time period, you need to utilize your evidence, your documents to make that point. So how did that piece of evidence show that? And again, remember, use purpose, use point of view, use historical context to prove how your document does that. Okay. As you move forward, then do that again. Your second piece of evidence in the paragraph, explain how it connects back to your X statement there. That's your paragraph. Okay. So right now, you would do that again in the third paragraph with your second argument. Then in your fourth paragraph, what you need to do is you need to bring 2 pieces of evidence. You need to explain something they haven't given you. Okay. You need to say the Declaration of Independence also showed blah, 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 blah. Okay, they didn't show you the declaration. That wasn't one of your documents. You are providing an additional document. You need to have 2 pieces of additional documents. That's why I've talked about when you're studying for this exam, one of the things that I would do is I would make sure that you've filled out that graphic organizer I gave you. Again, it's attached to the end of this document to have some pieces of evidence from each time period about the trade of that time period or the military of that time period or society of that time period. Have that on the ready so that you have the evidence ready to go, ready to plug in, no matter what they ask you. Flashcards are great to do that as well. If you'll just put the units and the different categories and go through them that way. You're going to make the same argument. You're going to say, this piece of evidence shows blah, 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 whatever argument you were making earlier. You're going to do that again. And then you're going to finish off your essay with a final paragraph telling contextualization after. So what happened after all of these events? Okay. So again, if they asked you from 1700 to 1800, you need to talk about what are some events that happened in the 1800s after this. Again, try to keep it in line with the topic. So if it's with the military, you want to continue on with what was a battle that happened afterwards. Was there peace afterwards? Was there treaties signed afterwards? Again, you want to keep it on the topic itself. Okay. So basically what I just showed you was a way to get 9 points on 9 out of 10. Again, a 6 or 7 is going to be a passing score. If you want to get that extra point, they have a point that's called complexity. If you're a little overwhelmed by all of this, or you're like, hey, this is going to be hard enough, I wouldn't worry about it. But if you find an opportunity, here's how you get the complexity point. You get the complexity point by making an argument, but then describing how there's nuance to that argument. For example, if you're saying that the military changed a lot during this time period, if you throw in there an example, while the military strategy changed a lot, the structure of how the military was set up remained the same. Officers in the British Army were still wealthy and controlled a lot of decisions that were made, while the soldiers that were on the front lines were still often the poorer members of society, and they did not get to participate in the strategic discussions. Notice what I did there. I said, look, my point still stands, but there's complexity to my argument because not everything changed during this time period in this point that I'm making. That they give an additional point because that's an overly complex argument. That would be how you would get that final 10th point. Now that is pretty hard to do. I think they said last year that it was about 0.4% of students got that point. So it's not, they don't reward it really easily, but that's how you do that. So I'm not going to go back into that. If you ever have any questions on that, feel free to shoot me an email, but I really focus on the rest of the points primarily. So let's do one together. Okay. So the College Board sent out an example of what your document or what your document-based question could be for this year, one that was shortened, modified to the 5 documents. And so here's what you're going to get. You're going to get directions here. Just basically all that I've said so far. You got to make a thesis, a prompt. You got to use the evidence, blah, 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 blah. So by the way, do not read that the day of the test. Okay. Read it now. Go online, read it. That's what they're grading you on. That's what I've been preparing you for. But guys, when you got 45 minutes and that timer's in the bottom part of your screen and it's ticking, I'm telling you, those are the instructions. They're right here. Don't spend that time reading what you already know. Okay. You skip right down to the prompt itself. Okay. Get to the prompt. The prompt, this one, that the example they gave is evaluate the extent to which indigenous peoples' reactions to state expansion differed during the period 1750 to 1900. Remember what we talked about doing whenever you get a prompt. Whenever you get a prompt, the first thing you do, what are they asking you? To compare, change over time, or causes? What are they asking? They're asking about, did people's reactions differ? Compare and contrast is what they're asking you to do. Were they different? Okay, so you need to show them ways that they were different. And if there were ways they stayed the same, you need to show them that also. Okay. The other things that we said you need to make sure that you do when getting a prompt, you need to make sure that you see, what did they give us any categories? Okay, did they? No, they didn't. They said, we got to explain it. We got to explain how they were different. So no categories given. The other thing was we got to look at the time period. Okay, they gave us a really defined time period, 1750 to 1900. Okay, so what I would then do is I would go down through each of these documents. And again, I would do the analysis that I did earlier. Now, I'm going to go over them. I did this one earlier, so I'm actually going to just look over my notes here from earlier. And again, this is great practice. If you want to pause it here and try to do this one yourself, it might be good practice for you. So you might want to pause the video, try it, do as best you can, then reopen the video up right now, and I'm going to show you what I did. Okay, so I'm going to give you, you want to do that? I think that could be good. If not, we can just dive right in here together. So again, when I did this earlier, and I haven't changed this, so this is what I did in real time. I went down through each of these documents and I tried to analyze them. So here were the notes. I'm just looking back over the notes of what I said. So I said, document 1, this Ashanti said that they wanted to fight back against any kind of rule by the Queen. So yeah, it says they'll never commit themselves to any policy. They said, and this is some kind of response, okay? So she wrote a response to the British government. So I said here that she protested with a response that they were going to push back on what they were doing. The second document I have is that I wrote down that they were going to fight against the rule of the Chinese. So this is a proclamation to soldiers and citizens where the Tong Hack says that again, let me see where I found that line about fighting back. Okay, yeah, exterminate the Japanese enemy. So there you go, they were pretty clear on that. So these were very aggressive, and at the end they said they were going to appeal to each other's patriotism. Again, so this is much stronger. This is talking about an army. This is talking about a military revolt or pushback. So I wrote here military response. Next, we have this picture of the Ethiopian Battle of Ottawa. And so I wrote here, this showed a military response. And by the way, this was one of the only successful times that a group that was invaded by a European power was able to defeat them. So, you know, that was kind of historical context I knew. So I wrote that down, you know, hey, my historical context is I knew this was one of the only times that an invading power beat the Europeans like they did. So I wrote that down here, another military response. Document 4, this is a document from Queen Lulu Kalani. Again, I always mispronounce her name, so I probably didn't do it justice there. But this is a letter of protest. She's protesting to the president. So very quickly, you know what I did? I've already in my notes connected document 2 and 3 are both about a military response. Document 1 and 4 are both letters of protest to the leader. So this was a letter of protest to the president. The first one was a letter of protest to the Queen. And in the final document here is this, it's a letter. I'm trying to see what I wrote down in my notes. It's a letter of protest. I wrote that again. And it was dealing specifically with the way the women were treated. And it talks about keeping their culture the same. And that the people who were taking them over were trying to ruin their culture and govern them. So what I did, now remember, you don't have to use all 5, you just have to use 4. So what I did is I connected 2 and 3. I said they were both military responses. And I connected 1 and 4, and I said they are both protests. They are both trying to solve the problem through the government, right? Through the proper mechanisms, by going to the leader and asking them not to take them over, not to try to control them. So boom, I got my thesis, right? One of my arguments is going to be that a lot of them push back using their military. My second argument is going to be not all of them did that. There were some that actually chose to enter into a formal protest with the governments of the people who were trying to invade them. So those are my 2 arguments. So my thesis statement is going to be something to that effect. There's going to be X, however, A, and I'm going to say therefore, but remember what I got to do first. I need to do contextualization. So here you go. I'm going to pull up a sheet of paper here. Zoom in a little bit. So here's how I would start my essay right here. The European countries began to move into areas of the world during the 1600s in search for resources. When they came upon indigenous peoples, they often tried to work with them in order to get these resources. In North America, for example, the French worked with the Native American tribes to get fur. Over time, though, we begin to see the Europeans become more aggressive in the way they attempt to influence the indigenous peoples. Okay. So I want you to notice what I did there. I started off by going, about 100 years before the prompt. I started talking through, again, it's all in relation to trying to control groups of people. I stayed with the prompt. I gave some very specific examples. I talked about the French. I talked about they were in search of resources. Did I use the word imperialism or colonialization? Okay, I would have probably added those type of terms in there just because, okay, like I go during the 1600s search for resources, during the age of imperialism. Okay, just when you can use those words like that, I mean, that shows that you really have a grasp of the language that was being used to describe those periods. That's all I need for contextualization to start off. I've told them what's happened beforehand, so now I'm going to jump right into it. Often the military or the indigenous peoples reacted to this aggression. I can't spell. To this aggression by using military force to throw out the oppressors. However, what was my other point? Oh, yeah. However, some native peoples attempted to negotiate with the heads of states of the invaders to attempt to ward off invasion. Therefore, let me go back to what the prompt said. You kind of, at the therefore statement, make sure that you're kind of addressing directly that prompt so that you show them that that's specifically what you're responding to. Sorry, prompt was reacted to state expansion differed. Okay. Therefore, while some of the responses to state aggression during 1750 to 1900 was similar, there were times the indigenous peoples reacted very differently. Okay, so that's what I did there with my thesis statement. I said, I made my points very clear that these are the two arguments I'm about to make. I made sure I went back and directly addressed the thesis statement, right? To say that, look, I am saying that there were differences, but I'm also pointing to some things that remain the same. So, but that would give me, again, thesis statement, you really got to have two things in it. You've got to make sure that you address the prompt directly, and you got to make sure you've got categories for the arguments that you're making, okay? So right now, I've got a point for contextualization. I've got 2 points for my thesis statement. So boom, I've got 3 points, rocking and rolling. My next paragraph is going to be that X statement. So I'm going to talk about the military. So I'm going to say something like, oh, no. I'm going to say, which was the first military document? Document 2. Okay. I'm going to miss Taksha. The Taksha people. Fought back against invaders using their military. And I would say document. Two. Yeah, sorry, actually, I would start with my topics in it. Sorry, I jumped again a little bit. I would actually start by saying many indigenous peoples fought back against potential invasion. Okay, so I start off with kind of a topic sentence like that. Then I would say, here's one example. Okay, they fought back using their military. This was a significant And so this is where I'm going to give some historical context. This was a significant risk because often the invaders had superior technology and weaponry. Okay, so that's my, I've used a document, I connected it back, and I provided some analysis, which I'm saying, look, this is why this is unique. So let's use my other document here. I've got that picture, okay? So I'm gonna say the Ethiopians, or I could actually do however, the Ethiopians were successful against the Italians in the Battle of Ottawa. So put document 3. This is a great example of how indigenous peoples did sometimes find success against their invaders. They were successful because they were, and again, this is some of the historical context I know from this example. I know that they were able to do this because they were incredibly motivated people. They had the belief that they actually, it's a long story, but they believed that they were actually destined by God to be a unique country in Africa. So I know that, and I also know that they greatly outnumbered the Italian troops, which, by the way, that was very true in most of this, but just usually the firepower overwhelmed them. So I'm going to say they were successful because they were more motivated and had greater numbers to fight with. Yeah, so, you know, what I, yep, so that's what you're looking at there. That would be a good paragraph there. Notice what all I've done. I addressed, again, I tied it back. I'm making an argument that this was an invasion. This is an example of an invasion or a military response. This was a successful one. That's my historical context. And I explained there that how they were able to be successful. So I showed them my knowledge of that event and similar events surrounding. My next paragraph, I would do the same thing with our other 2 sources. So I would say there were some indigenous peoples who attempted to negotiate their freedom through letters to government officials. Then I would go in and I would explain the steps there, just like we did in the previous paragraph about the 2 sources that I have there that show that. Again, I think that's, you know, that this is probably something you're pretty familiar with. I would then find my paragraph here later on, and so the next paragraph, remember, once you do that, the next paragraph is going to be your additional evidence. So what I would do for additional evidence is I would say, I'm trying to think where I want to go with this. We're talking about military, but I'll just use America. Always, you know, that's an easy one to use. When the British government tried to have greater influence on the colonists in, actually wait, that's not indigenous. No, let's not do that. The Americans aren't indigenous, right? They were actually Europeans came over. Let's just, we can use the Native Americans in America. Let's do, no, we can think of one better than that. Let's do, here you go. When the French took over colonies in Southeast Asia, specifically Vietnam. We saw the Vietnamese people organize a military response to keep their freedom. They ultimately were successful at throwing out the French troops. Okay. So there's one example. Notice I try to be specific. I try to give the countries involved. If you can remember the battle, it's about all of Dung Ben Phu. But I mean, you just want to get as specific as you can there. You want to give two examples like that. Again, you want to make sure the example is an argument you've made. So I could always give a letter. I could do a letter. My other piece of evidence could be the letter that was sent to the British government from, or is it Algeria, that they asked them to leave. They attempted to do that, and then you could even talk about any of those other. There were several African countries that attempted to negotiate their way out of colonial rule. The Mai Mai rebellion in Kenya is another example of a military response. Whatever it is, and again, that's why I think having that graphic organizer, or having some examples on the ready in your mind of, hey, I can use these if they ask me about military or if they ask me about societal change. Then the only thing we would have left, again, I'm kind of skipping over the details here, but you can, hopefully you can hear from my explanation there how I would flesh those two paragraphs out. And then finally, I would end with my final contextualization. I would end by describing what happened next, that after all of this, and World War I occurs, and Woodrow Wilson, the United States, tell the European countries they don't think they should have colonies anymore, that they think they should let these indigenous peoples rule themselves. And that's really when we see the end of imperialism. That's when we begin to see those local peoples being able to govern for themselves moving forward without this type of influence. So boom, I give 3 to 5 sentences explaining that. Notice I said things like World War I, Woodrow Wilson, colonization being over. I use some of those phrases that people would be familiar with of the time period to help make that argument. So I hope that was helpful. I hope that general overview provided you some context there of how you could write it and what my thought process would be going through it. Again, I would look over this. If I were studying here the night before the exam, what I would do is I would look over, broadly speaking, the units and some specifics that happen in the units. Again, here's that graphic organizer I gave you guys. I thought this would be a quick, easy way to review, is you could just look at the different time periods and just jot down some things you remember about society of that time, about politics of that time, about culture of that time. Again, it's just real quick. Maybe you look over this, and if you remember a lot of these, don't worry about it. But if you get to like the 1400s, the 1700s, and you're like, I cannot remember anything about the politics of countries during that time. Okay, we'll just sit, write out some things about what was going on in Europe, what was going on in Asia, what was going on in the further West. And jot those things down and just give yourself some context there, because this time is going to move rather quickly. I guess that's the other thing I would say to you. I would take 10 minutes to read through the sources. I would take about 5 minutes to read the thesis, to work on your thesis statement. Then I would get into writing, and I would spend the rest of my time writing the essay itself. And as you're writing, remember they grade it as a rough draft. They're not going to take off points for misspelled words, or for not having proper syntax or something. You try to do as best you can, but realize, you saw me right there with that rough draft. I'd misspell. I would go back when I'm done. What I would do is go back and look over, if I have time, misspelled words. I would go back over and say, is everything clear? Did I say this the right way? But again, remember, they're grading it as a rough draft. They're not expecting it to be perfect. They're looking to see, did you have points there for your thesis? Did you have points for contextualization? Did you use the evidence? Did the evidence tie back to the prompt? Did you analyze that evidence? That's what they're looking for. That's what they're rewarding points for. Again, remember, you don't have to use all the documents. You need to use 4. I'm going to tell you right now, my advice is if you read and there's 2 of them, you just don't get it. You don't know how to use them. You can only use 3. I would advise you to use those 3 and just do as best you can. Use 2 in one paragraph, use 1 in the other. Try to do everything else like I talked about. Try to do contextualization at the beginning and the end. try to get that thesis statement sound, try to get 2 pieces of additional evidence, and I think you're going to be okay. Again, you don't have to be perfect on the exam to pass it, but you need to get 6 or 7 points. So again, I would also just make sure that I emphasize, don't stress out, do as best you can. Guys, I know this can be very, it can be stressful. It's a hard test. You know, there is that pressure that comes with it. But again, you know, you, especially as a sophomore sitting for this exam, you know, I'm proud of you. I know that that's hard to do. Not everybody does that. And a lot of students don't do that. So do as best you can to really try to, if you're stressing out about something, go back to the outline, go back to the things we talked about, and really just try to move through there and just do the best you can with what you've got. Again, try to make sure that it's clear. Try to make sure you fully explain yourself. Think of it as, you know, that, yeah, you are writing to someone who knows something about history, but they are judging, can you explain your evidence? They gave you the evidence. They know you can just quote it, but can you explain how that makes the argument that you're trying to put across? That's what the reader's looking for. So make sure you close the loop and explain why you're using the sources that you chose. Make sure that you clearly address the prompt. Make sure you thoroughly read the prompt so that you're addressing it directly. And again, what I would do then is when I got finished, I would finish off that contextualization last paragraph, and then I would look back whatever you wrote, and I would send it off. Again, it's your choice whether to write it or type it. That's your choice in this year's exam. And the other thing I would tell you is, you know, you want to make sure I would get on my e-ticket. I would make sure that's available. I would make the decision. Am I going to write it? Am I going to type it? Make sure that you already know those things. You don't want to be trying to decide them the day of the exam. I would also go on AP in their little, you know, portal there. They allow you to go on and register and see what it looks like the day of the test. You can even actually go through and sign in like you would sign in tomorrow just to get practice to see what it looks like. I haven't had any students have a problem with it, so I think you'll be fine. But again, that might give you some peace of mind there in order to do that. And please, if you have any questions between today and tomorrow, feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll be sure to check that so I can help you in any way that I can. And again, good luck. I'm excited to hear how you do, so I'd love for you to shoot me an email afterwards and tell me how you did. So good luck, everybody, and I will talk to you soon.